Welcome to Emily.
Thanks, Mike. And as we go here, as I'm talking, if anything starts to break up or anything like that, if you could just interrupt me and I'll go back where I was before. So you can hear me okay now, right?
Yep, you're good.
All right. So again, my name is Emily Heald. I'm the statewide rivers educator for UW-Madison Division of Extension, here to talk to you today about some of the smaller, less visible creatures that we have living in our area waters. So I know the title that talks about lake creatures, it's the Lakes Conference, but just know as we go, a lot of these critters are found in all sorts of waters, rivers, and streams too. All right, so when we first start to think about a lake and all the different critters that live in the lake and how they interact, a lot of times we picture something that looks a little bit like this, right? So we think about the fish, the big fish eat the little fish eat the tiny fish. Sometimes we think about birds swooping in and eating the fish. Sometimes we think about plants, but very, very rarely do people think about this bottom baseline layer of the food chain, the plankton, the bacteria, all the really small, invisible stuff that virtually supports everything else. And in fact, if you zoom in a little bit down to that layer of the food web onto all the little stuff, we see all these complex interactions. Look at all these arrows going all over the place. Each of those is symbolizing an interaction, and that's what we're going to be going over today, is all these virtually invisible animals that play a huge role in lake life. And so what the plan is for today is I'm going to tell you a little bit about a lot of really small creatures. I have a jam-packed presentation today. I'm going to keep an eye on the time, and hopefully we can get through as many as possible. So we're going to start really, really small, and then we'll work our way up. So we're going to start with plankton. I think that plankton became a really popular concept and word once this cartoon character was invented named Plankton over here. I wonder if anyone recognizes this guy from SpongeBob SquarePants. Unfortunately, this plankton is a villain, but I like to dream of a world where plankton will be a main character and a hero in the story. So anyway, a little background on plankton. That word, I like to know where words are derived from. I think it tells you a lot about them. That word is derived from the Greek word plankos, which means wandering or drifting. So that's because plankton are so small, they can control their movements slightly depending on the species, but they're all ultimately at the whim of the currents, and they're going to go where the water takes them. And there are actually two major types of plankton. There's phytoplankton, with that phyto part of the word coming from the word photosynthesis, which we're going to talk about. So like trees, grass, flowers, phytoplankton are converting energy from the sun into usable energy for animals. There's a picture of phytoplankton right there, and I'm going to show you lots more pictures. And then we have zooplankton. So that, I know it looks like zooplankton, but it's zooplankton. So that zoo, that means animal, meaning that these guys cannot make their own food from the sun like phytoplankton can. They have to eat other animals, and it's usually phytoplankton. And look at that cutie. We're going to talk all about them. All right. So a common term for phytoplankton to help you become more familiar is algae. So we're going to use these terms interchangeably here for the rest of the presentation. Algae are the very base of the food chain, and they're photosynthetic. So that means they use energy from the sun to make their own food. And that's important because all energy in our lives initially comes from the sun. And so having these organisms that convert sunlight into usable energy is vital for the existence of everything else, right? So you and I cannot directly gain energy from the sun. You don't go out into the sun and come inside feeling full or satiated. We need other organisms to convert that energy into that sunlight energy into usable energy for us so that we can consume it and gain energy from the sun in that way. So if you're not familiar with the process of photosynthesis, what happens, and this is a plant here, but just know it's the same with algae. What happens is that the sunlight will hit the algae or the plant in this example. The plant turns that energy into sugar, and that's what we eat and get energy from. But another byproduct of that process is oxygen formation. So I'm sure you've always heard that plants make oxygen, right? Well, so do algae through that process of photosynthesis. In fact, across the world, phytoplankton generate about half the oxygen that we have in the atmosphere. So here's a little group activity for everyone in the audience. I want everyone just to take a deep breath in, or just to be conscious of their breath for a second. And thank algae for that. All right, so in that way, Algae are the backbone to everything that happens in lakes. They're the glue that keeps everything together. They hold everything up. They're the powerhouse of the lake. They are the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the water. And so when we're thinking about where algae live, well, pretty much anywhere, keeping in mind that they need sunlight in order to survive. That's what's feeding them. You're most likely to see algae near the surface of the water because that's where it's brighter and they have more access to sunlight. And so some algae actually have little air balloons inside of them called gas vesicles. So if you look really closely at this picture, these elongated cells right here are gas vesicles, and they can fill those with air to bring the algae closer to the surface of the water. And that can give some algae an advantage over others. So some are free floating within the lake and you never see them. And then some also grow on rocks or on plants too. So if you look into the water and you see a scummy or slimy rock, a lot of times that is algae too. And some algae are really interesting because they can move. So this one right here, many algae are at the whim and the free will of the water movements and go wherever the water takes them. But some of the algae that live on rocks can actually move. So the slit down the algae, that's called a raphe, and this actually secretes mucus to help it scoot along on rocks. And so again, where do algae live? It depends on the type of algae. There are thousands of species of algae, but most often you're going to find them free floating within the lake or stuck on rocks. So I keep saying depends on the species, depends on the species. We'll be saying that a lot during this presentation. And so I want to give you an idea of how incredibly diverse and beautiful algae can be when you look at them under a microscope. I know we tend to just think of algae as like the slimy yuck in the lake, but I hope you're starting to understand not only how incredibly important they are to the lake, but if you look at them under a microscope, they're actually really beautiful. So just a couple examples of algae that I think are cool. This one right here is called Volvox, and all these little green blobs inside the big blob, it's actually cloning itself. Some algae like this one over here are colonial. I like to think of them as a town working together. Some of them are making nitrogen into usable energy. Some are keeping it floating. This one over here has a really nice lattice structure inside it to keep it stable. This one in the center here responds to different stressor chemicals in the environment, and it can actually make these pointy ends even pointier to protect itself. And again, a lot of algae are free floating. We talked about some that move. This is a good example of one that can move. It has this little tail here called a flagella, and that can help it swim around to move. So yeah, just a couple of pictures of some beautiful algae. Some are a little boring looking. They just look like peas. So again, why do we care about blobby yuck in a lake that can sometimes be a pain? Well, it's because they support everything else in the lake by converting the energy from the sun into usable energy that we can eat. So moving up the food chain to zooplankton, these guys are my favorites. These are heterotrophic, meaning they cannot make their own food, meaning they do not undergo that process of photosynthesis. They have to eat other organisms just like you and I. So some of them are herbivorous or vegetarians, and they'll only eat algae. And other ones are carnivorous, like this guy over here we'll talk about in a little bit, and they eat other zooplankton. So as you can already see, and we'll get into this, they are an incredibly diverse and really cool looking group. So where would you find zooplankton in a lake? Well, pretty much anywhere. It depends what they eat. If the zooplankton's eating algae, then it'll probably be found pretty close to the algae, but at surface of a lake. But they can also withstand extreme temperature, extreme conditions. So like bog lakes, which are usually really acidic, you'll find zooplankton in those. You can even find zooplankton in vernal pools sometimes. So if you have an area in the woods that is wet most of the time, but then dries up, you can sometimes find zooplankton in there too. They have really interesting life cycles I just want to touch on. Their life cycle, just like algae, like I said, it's going to depend on the species, where some are reproducing sexually and they'll lay eggs. That's an example of this one over here. And then the insect babies will hatch and molt and grow larger with each molt. So you can see this one, the egg first hatches and it looks like a tick, and then they get bigger over time until they're large enough to reproduce on their own. And then other ones like this one in the middle here, this is Daphnia. This is actually a lady. She will clone herself. So most of the population is actually female for this type of zooplankton. That's girl power there. So all these little blobs inside our mom here, these are all clones. And they have a really interesting trait where right before winter, or if they sense some sort of like an environmental stressor, like a sudden increase in predators or turbulence, they actually lay what are called resting eggs that are pictured over here. And these are a super sturdy egg pouch that sinks to the bottom and just lies in the sediment until conditions improve. So I have a video of Daphnia reproducing. I really hope that you can see it okay. The sound doesn't matter because I can just narrate this. Let me move my things around on my screen here. Let's see. So what we're looking at here, this is the bottom, this is the butt of the Daphnia here, and she's got this slit down her front of her belly here that opens up, and she's going to open it up and kick her clones out. So check this out. Did you see that guy just kind of get kicked right out of there? Look at that baby. Aw. And then here comes another one. She's trying. So that's magic of life right there. That's the circle of life. All right, so that's just downright cute. All right, so as with algae, I want to show you how incredibly diverse and beautiful and interesting these things are. These are the gals I just showed you that clone themselves. They can also change the shape of what they look like in response to predation. So they can change the size and shape of their helmet so that they're more difficult to eat. And that progression is what's being shown here. So you can see this is getting gradually pointier as the generations are picking up on some sort of environmental stressor. These cute little guys over here, these Bosmina, can make this little tail point longer. These ones over here, I mentioned them earlier. This is Leptodora. These are predaceous and actually pretty vicious. They're darn near invisible in the water, and you see these really long arms over here. That's what they use to capture their prey, and then what they'll do is basically suck out the prey's juices and discard that exoskeleton. These other guys down here, this plankton right here, this zooplankton right here is the same species as is in someone's hand over here. And these guys make sort of a jelly sort of coat around them for protection. They look like little tapioca balls. You can see all of them have this singular eye for sensing light. Again, very, very cute and very interesting. And if you're wondering, I've actually scared a lot of children teaching them about zooplankton, and they see pictures like this, and they're like, oh my God, I'm scared to swim in the water. But, you know, if you're wondering what they look like for size, yes, they are visible to the naked eye, but only if you have a really concentrated amount of them in a jar like this. If you're just swimming, you're not going to be able to see them. They're not going to bite you. They're not going to swim up to you and sniff you and wonder what you're doing or anything like that. They're very harmless. They are sampled with these nets here. I have a couple of different pictures so you can see this gal's in a smaller pond situation, and this is out on the Great Lakes, but same idea. These nets are cone shaped, and then you just lower them down into the water. They're a very fine mesh. And then as you pull them back up, all of the zooplankton gets concentrated down into the bottom of a cup down here, and you can dump them into a jar. So again, just to stress the importance of zooplankton, remember we talked about how important algae are to convert that sunlight. So for a lot of animals, algae are too small to see and eat. So these guys, the zooplankton, they eat the algae, and then zooplankton are a very, very important food source for fish. So most fish at some point in their life depend on zooplankton to eat. And so in that way, zooplankton are really the link between algae and everything else. So moving on, here's a really interesting creature. We're not going to go into too much detail, but this one is called a tardigrade, also known as a water bear, also known as a moss piglet, which I think is a really cute little name for them. They do look like little bears or little pigs, except that they have 8 legs. And a lot of people say if the world ends, cockroaches will be what survives, but no, I believe it will be the water bear. So there are about 900 different species of water bears that live in aquatic to, you know, quote unquote, terrestrial aquatic environments. So think things like lakes, lake edges, ponds, and then aquatic terrestrial means things like moss. So you can actually find these things living in moss on the side of trees. I've heard of people finding them moss that's growing on a roof. And these guys are really, really hardy. There's a whole list of features here that they've lived through. So they can withstand temperatures down to minus 450 degrees up to boiling. They can even be boiled in alcohol and still survive. They can survive 30 years frozen, which means 30 years without food. They've survived exposure in outer space, which is a vacuum environment with extreme radiation. They can withstand pressure up to 6 times the pressure of the deepest part of the ocean, which is twice as much pressure as bacteria can withstand. Honestly, I think at this point, I like to imagine the scientists in the lab doing this because I think they were just trying to see what could kill these guys. All right, the next species or a group of species that I want to talk about are called the Hydra. So I know there's a lot going on this slide, but we're going to talk through all of these pictures. Hydra are named after the mythical creature that you may have heard of called the Hydra. And this is the dragon-like dinosaur where it has many heads. And if you cut one off, it'll grow 2 more. Then we're going to talk about why that's actually a fitting metaphor for the Hydra, the actual Hydra here. Their cell structure is super simple. So they do not have organs or tissues like you and I. They just have layers of cells. Some of them are for capturing prey. Some of those cells help with digestion or etc. We're going to talk more about that too. Now I have pictures of jellyfish and coral up here because Hydra are actually related to jellyfish and coral. This picture is what they actually look like, but I can't help, don't they look exactly like those inflatable things that you see around car dealerships? Or around like people having big sales or something like that. So I think of that. I hope, you know, if you can take one thing away, I want you to look at these big blow up things and think of Hydra from now on. Hydra are carnivorous and they eat their prey in a really cool and interesting way. So what they will do, so we have our Hydra here, right, all stretched out. So they start by stretching out really, really far with their tentacles here. And those are feeling around for food. They don't move, so they're not like actively pursuing prey. They suction to the surface they're on. So whatever food they capture basically has to come to them. And once they feel a prey, they'll use those specialized cells called nematocysts that are in the tips of their tentacles here. And they use those to fire a toxin into their prey that will basically immobilize that prey. And then they're going to grab on to the prey and shove it down into their body cavities. So you can see this is a cross section of a Hydra here. They'll use those tentacles and then just shove that prey down into that cavity. And this is a picture of what a Hydra looks like with a prey animal inside of it. It looks like it's eating a little aquatic insect or something there. So they eat living things. They eat small food particles floating around. So I like to think of these guys kind of as like the vacuum of lakes. They're really cleaning things up. They live where food is most prominent, and so you'll usually see them in more shallow waters. Again, they suction onto substrates, so that could be a log or a plant or the side of a fish tank, you know, anything like that. They're going to be in shallow water looking for those food particles. So you're not going to see these guys super deep in the waters that you're looking for them in. Their reproduction is asexual. That means that they do not need a mate. They do it all on their own, and it's called budding. And it basically means that you're growing a clone of yourself that eventually detaches. So you can see in these pictures here, you have your main Hydra growing here, and then we're budding a new Hydra off here, and then there's a new one coming out here. And then you can also see these 2 little ones coming off of our main Hydra here. So what'll happen is that these will eventually pinch off and start to be their own Hydra that's budding itself. So if you were to squish one of these, the pieces could grow into a new Hydra. And that's why that mythical creature reference, the Hydra where you cut the head off and you get 2 new heads, that's why it's so fitting for a Hydra. They produce, you know, under good conditions, they can produce these buds, you know, 1 to 2 buds every few days. And depending on predation, they can actually live up to 4 years, which is quite a long time for a simple celled creature like this. Sponges are next. This is after zooplankton. I gotta say, sponges are probably my next favorite. Did you know there are sponges in a lot of lakes and rivers around here? So sponges, just like you'd see in the ocean, sort of. This is like what you kind of think of when you think of an ocean sponge. Same type of animal, but they look a little different from the ocean. Here's an example of what freshwater sponges look like down here. Sponges are filter feeders. So I like to think of these just like a pool filter. They're constantly drawing water in and filtering out particles of food to eat. That's what this diagram's showing here. Don't worry about how scientific this looks. You don't need to understand anything on this diagram, except that the sponge is sucking water in through the outside, okay? And then cells on the inside are going to grab and digest those food particles, and anything the sponge doesn't want gets pumped back out. So that really is like that pool filter motion. Suck in, you grab everything, and then you pump out whatever you don't want. And because they are filter feeders like that, their existence in the water is a really good indicator of water quality, because they're pretty much absorbing everything in the water. So they're very sensitive to pollutants. And I have a video that I want to show you of sponges. I only got to move a couple things around on my screen so this gets muted. Okay. It's not important for you to hear. I can narrate it myself. Let's see. So what's happening in this video? These are marine sponges, but again, very similar to, you won't see them looking like this. I'm going to show you pictures of what they look like, but I want you to see that filtering concept. So what's going on in this video is they're putting a little bit of dye around the outside of the sponge, and then you can see it gets sucked in and pumped back out. Just like a pool filter, right? All right, so here are some examples of freshwater sponges. Interestingly, not a lot is known about sponges. There's still a lot of gaps in the sponge knowledge base, except for SpongeBob SquarePants. We know a lot about him. Even finding pictures online of freshwater sponges is difficult. I actually took these 3 pictures of very wonderful sponges that I found out in the wild. And you can see they can look very different. They can be really branchy, or they can be a little bit more mossy. And sponges, if you ever find one out in a lake or river, I highly encourage you to smell it. They have a very interesting, distinct smell. It's kind of musty, but I can just imagine it right now. It's very distinct and interesting. Another little interesting tidbit about sponges is that you cannot identify them to species just by looking at them. You actually need to look at them under a microscope. So these are what a sponge will look like under a microscope, and these are what are called spicules. These are pointy structures that are embedded throughout the sponge, and they're what gives the sponge its structure. And the type of spicule determines the species. So you could have 2 sponges that look very different that could potentially be the same species, and you determine that by looking at them under a microscope. So the next type of animal I'd like to talk about are mussels. These aren't, exactly small like everything else that we've seen, but I think they're hidden in the sense that they're often overlooked. And if you look in this picture here, they are very well camouflaged. And so, yeah, often overlooked. And so we're going to start with them, or we're going to continue on with them, because I think that they are very interesting as well. So to start with on mussels, in the state of Wisconsin, we actually have some of the highest diversity of freshwater mussels in the world right here in North America. And over half of the species in Wisconsin of mussels, there are 50 of them are threatened. And so they're not doing very well. They're extremely sensitive to changes in water quality. They require very clean water, just like we talked about with the Hydra. Since they're constantly filtering that water in and they can't really choose the water they're filtering, they're very sensitive to any changes in water quality. And they're also a really important food source to a lot of other animals. So like beavers, otters, raccoons, some fish for the smaller mussels, herons, etc. You're actually most likely to see piles of mussel shells like you see over here, where an animal sat and feasted on them. These are called mussel shell middens. It's a pile of mussel shells. Like a few of the other ones we discussed today, again, they're important for water because they're filter feeders. And so they are helping to filter out the algae and the food particles from the water. So they're helping to clean that water. All right, mussels are constantly sucking water in and filtering it. So depending on the species, again, they can filter 13 to 80 gallons of water a day, just depending on that species. If you are lucky enough to be snorkeling and to sneak up on one of these and find it in the act of filtering, it looks a little bit like this with this is like a mouth that is coming out, and they actually have two of these. You can almost see it in this picture. There's one here and there's one over here. They look like they're talking out of the sides of their mouth or something. One is sucking water in, and then it'll go inside the mussel and it'll get filtered for whatever it wants to consume. And then anything it doesn't want gets spit back through the other opening. Just like that. So one's sucking water in and one's blowing filtered water back out. So most mussels, again, because they can't really move to find more food, they prefer flowing water so that there's always a resupply of water to filter. So that's why you'll most often find them in rivers, but you find them in lakes too. They burrow into the bottom of the sediment, they filter away. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, because they're constantly sucking in and filtering the water, they're extremely sensitive to declines in water quality. So if you have a decline in water quality, it's usually the mussels that are dying off first. And that's why so many mussels in the States are in a threatened or endangered state. And not to spend too much time on mussels, but they're just so interesting. They have an incredibly interesting life cycle. So there are male and female mussels, and they do reproduce sexually, but there's no contact between the two when they mate. The male will basically just release the sperm out into the water and has to hope it comes in contact with a female and her eggs. So once the eggs are fertilized, they become what are called glaucidia, and they are released into the water. They're parasitic and they need to attach to a fish's gills to complete their life cycle. So what they're going to do is get spit out into the water and then hope they land on some fish gills. They will attach to the fish gills, and they're parasitic. They need those gills to complete their life cycle. And they hang out on the fish gills for a while. They're not harming the fish, but they are safe there, and they can get some of the blood supply from the fish. They can get food particles that the fish leave behind while they eat. And then after a while, those glaucidia will fall off and be these, right here it says free living juveniles. They grow and mature in place until they are grown enough to reproduce themselves. So a couple more pictures. The process of those baby mussels attaching to fish is an incredible process. Again, the mussels can't swim, so getting those babies to attach to fish gills is quite the act. A lot of mussels will actually impersonate fish. You can see here, this is not a fish right here. This is actually part of the mussel. And what they're doing is impersonating prey fish, okay? So larger fish will think that this is a tasty snack to eat, and they'll come over to try to eat it. And then the mussel will spray the glaucidia into the fish's mouth so that they get stuck on the gills. So here's a picture of what glaucidia look like. Glaucidia look like under a microscope, and here you can see them latched onto fish gills. If you were to just look at a fish, you know, with the naked eye, they look really small like this. Again, not hurting the fish. They don't want to hurt their host because that would be detrimental to them. They're kind of just sharing. They're just sharing with those fish for a little bit. And, you know, with all the other groups we discussed, a highly diverse group here. At first glance, I know mussels all look the same. They're really tough to identify. But if you start to look more closely at them, some of them have ridges here. Some of them are a beautiful purple color on the inside. Some of them have a really pretty pearl type of sheen on the inside, maybe more pink. Some of them are really tiny, so there can be quite a size difference as well. Some of them are really tiny and some of them are really big. So moving on, our next creatures are amoebas, and I have amoeba earrings on today in honor of this amoeba slide here. So I think that amoebas gained popularity in the news because There happens to be a species of amoeba called brain-eating amoeba, which is deadly, but don't worry, it's extremely rare. It's mostly in southern states, so 99.99% of amoebas are great. They're awesome. They're unicellular, so these are not visible with the naked eye. These are all microscopic images. They're made up of only one cell, and they eat bacteria and dead organic materials. So they're really great recyclers in your lake. They eat dead stuff, they're eating themselves. So they're recycling, all that dead stuff that's in the lake. And they're also a great food source for plankton and super small fish. There's some fun terminology that goes with amoebas. The first one is pseudopodia. So that first part, pseudo, that's Greek for false or pretend. And then podia means foot. So we're talking false feet here. And that's referring to how amoebas move. I have a video of that I'm going to show you. But these right here, these little extensions right here, those are basically the pseudopodia right there. And what they do is extend themselves. They basically just stretch themselves out and then flow into themselves to move. So they don't have feet, but they move like they do. Another fun word that I'm going to show you in action is phagocytosis. This word, when you break it down, is a little less interesting. Phagine means to eat, chitos means cell. So this is what's happening here is an amoeba surrounds their prey with its entire body to engulf that prey, and then it digests it. So these two words, pseudopodia and phagocytosis, they go together. I'm going to show you the video of how the amoeba, we don't need sound here, is going to eat two other microscopic organisms. So this is sped up quite a bit. And so you can see how it's using those false feet to flow into itself. And it's surrounding those prey items here, these paramecium. And then the paramecium they realize they're stuck. And so what's going to happen is that amoeba is going to secrete some enzymes to slowly break down the paramecium and then absorb it and utilize its nutrients. So wait till you hear about these guys next. I bet some of you have seen these in lakes before. These are kind of common. I always get at least one call in the summer of someone saying, like, I found this big blobby brain thing in my lake and I have no idea what it is. These are called Bryozoans. Sometimes they're called moss animals. These are an incredibly old type of animal. They've been in the fossil record for over 4 million years. These are fossil images of the Bryozoans. There's about 5,000 different species of Bryozoans, and most of them are marine species that live in the oceans. However, there's about 20 species of freshwater Bryozoans here in North America. They are, like most of the animals we've talked about so far, invertebrates, meaning they don't have a backbone, and they are colonial, which we talked about when we talked about algae. So if you look at one of these blobs, again, it's like a big blobby brain town. And so they're all specialized to have different jobs. So some of the cells do feeding, some of them are hatcheries for reproduction, some of them help with defense. So yeah, again, big blobby brain town. And yeah, so people find these in lakes all the time and be wondering about what they are. So what goes on here with Bryozoans is that there are many individuals, as we just went over. So each individual looks like this. So this is your Bryozoan here, a big blobby brain town. And then if you zoom into it, you actually have these individuals like this. This is one under a microscope, and where they have tentacles to trap the food. And then they basically secrete a mucus around themselves to attach to each other. So it's a lot of animals that look like this in the video, and they secrete that blobby mucusy material so that they can attach to each other more in that kind of like brain looking substance here. So this is an up close video of the tentacles and what they look like. Again, those are waving around in the water column, waiting for food particles to come in. And once they grab those food particles, they can grab them, shove them inside their body cavity and absorb them. Here's kind of a cool image of that bryozoan emerging from its mucousy structure. So they can retreat if they sense any sort of predation coming out. And then once they sense the coast is clear, they can unfurl themselves and start grabbing food particles again. These are pictures of marine bryozoans. The ones that live in lakes and rivers are more of those blobby brain looking ones, but I just thought that these were so pretty, I couldn't help but include these. You can see them a little bit more with a naked eye for the marine bryozoans, and you can see with some of these that are more clear, this animal living inside its mucus secretion here. All right, so with hidden lake creatures, we really are just skimming the surface with all the cool things that get overlooked in lakes. There are so many others that we don't have time to go over today. I could say a lot more about sponges. There's Ophrydium. There are different types of freshwater shrimp that live in lakes and rivers. There are macroinvertebrates or nymph stages of insects that we tend to see, like dragonflies and damselflies. Those actually live most of their lives in water, but we don't have the time to go over them today. So just know, what you see in a lake, and what we've gone over today, there's actually a lot more where that came from. I'd love to talk to you and do part 2 sometime, and we can go over even more species. And so in conclusion, lakes are beautiful resources. They're incredibly relaxing places to recreate, but they're also full of so many different plants and animals and have so many complex interactions occurring. So I hope, next time you're having your cup of coffee on your lake in the morning, you look out and you see a scene like this. I hope it starts to look a little bit more like this for you, where you're picturing all of the really little tiny things that are going on in a lake that actually make a big difference in the food web. And also just wanted to end on a couple quotes here. I think that these are kind of funny and also very applicable to this talk. If you're shopping for a home entertainment system, you can't do better than a good dissecting microscope. The other one is, the simplest pocket microscope will reveal wonders 1,000 times more thrilling than anything Alice saw behind the looking glass. And with that, we can take any questions that the audience might have.
All right, thanks, Emily, for that great talk. The way this will work is we'll take questions from the audience here in the auditorium, and I will pass them on to you. And we'll also be checking the chat online for any questions, which we'll read out loud for the people in the audience, and you'll be able to reply to them. And I promise, no matter how tempting it is, I will not do a SpongeBob SquarePants imitation while asking the questions. So, any questions for Emily? Oh, you could hold on to the microphone.
I'm just wondering if there's part 2 of this or more information. How would you go about getting that?
Sure. The question, Emily, is if there's a part 2, are you presenting that someplace else? Is it available online somewhere?
I'm waiting for my invitation to the conference next year, Mike.
Maybe that might be a Wisconsin Lakes webinar that we'll do sometime in the near future too. That would be kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
Another question from the crowd.
Can you talk a little bit more about algae blooms? You talked about a lot of these each other or each seems like one of the big concerns is just the amount of nutrients.
Sure. So the question is about algae blooms and die-offs and whether that results in excess nutrients being released back into the water.
It can. So a lot of times when we see algae blooms, we hear about blue-green algae, right? And I actually took that slide out because I wasn't sure if I would have enough time to cover blue-green algae. Blue-green algae are actually a type of bacteria, and they have a lot of different things going on inside of them that can give them an advantage over the other algae. And so they can take advantage of nutrients a lot easier. And they also have, we talked about those gas vesicles that lift them up to be higher in the water column. And they have quite the robust gas vesicle system, and they can float at the surface of the water and basically outcompete other algae for sunlight. And so they have the advantage over a lot of algae to begin with, and they're really responsive to different types of nutrients. And so when you have an influx of nutrients into your lakes, be that from, you know, sometimes that can just happen naturally after a big rain, it's getting late in the summer, or you'll see it get worse in lakes where there's a lot of development around the lake. And so you have a lot of extra nutrients coming into the lake. And so they can really take advantage of those conditions and become a little problematic. They also release a toxin that is detrimental to other algae, but it's also something that you don't want your dogs and you don't want to be drinking yourself. Does that answer the question that was being asked?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Of course, I think the follow-up question is, why do we name things that they actually aren't? If it's, you don't have to answer that. That was rhetorical. Another question from the audience. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to, let everyone know that we do actually have a talk later today at 1:30, all about harmful algal blooms and your health. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some more questions about the embryology.
Yeah, that's great. There is a talk at 1:30 on harmful algal blooms. I don't remember if that's part of the virtual stream or not. For those of you watching now, it is perfect. Well, that was a great promotion.
Good
Another
planning.
question.
Good planning.
You know, and then see kind of a gelatinous blob on a log down in the water or on the in the water. Is that one of these Bryozoans, or is that a possible eggs from the product or something like that?
Sure. The question is, if you run across a gelatinous blob on a log underwater, is it a rhizoan or eggs, or what do you think it might be?
It depends. Oh man, blobby things can be so many cool things. The bryozoans, they're going to be really brain shaped. Like that's truly what people say is like, it's something that's brain shaped. And it looks like it has like all the wrinkles that a brain would have. And if you touch it, be really careful. I don't want you pulling things out of the lake and killing anything, but if you touch it, it's kind of firm. And some of the other blobby things like egg masses and Ophradium and different types of algae that are also blobby and brain-like, they tend to be a lot softer. So the bryozoan will be a little bit more firm.
Next question. All right, so two questions. One, are there invasive zooplankton, and do they cause problems like other aquatic invasive species? And then the second question is, how do tardigrades get onto moss on trees?
All right, so first question, are there invasive zooplankton? Yes, there is spiny water flea that's invasive. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, so there are spiny water fleas that are invasive. They're right here. And these are a type of zooplankton. They're from over in Europe and were brought here in ballast water in big shipping tanks. And what they do is, you remember I showed you the zooplankton, the Daphnia, the ones that clone themselves and eat algae. So spiny water flea is actually a voracious predator of those Daphnia. And those Daphnia are very important in lakes because they help to keep our algae in check. So we have, there are sets of checks and balances in our ecosystem. So when you introduce a predator like spiny water flea, you're taking away that check of algae. So what we can tend to see over time is that lakes will get, if you're familiar with secchi depth, the secchi depth will decrease, the visibility or the clarity of the water will decrease when you have spiny water flea coming in. They're also very difficult with that spine for baby fish to eat. And then, so does that answer the first question for that person?
Yes.
Okay. And then when we're talking about water bears, so there's so many different species. It's not that they're climbing out of the lake to get onto the tree. It's just that's where they're born and raised. So just depending on the species is going to affect the distribution of that particular species of water bear.
right, next question.
We have Chinese mystery snails and I wonder how impactful they are to some of these healthy organisms and how impactful they are to humans.
So a good pre-lunch question. The question is about Chinese mystery snails and how harmful they are to the kind of creatures that you were talking about in your talk, and then how tasty are they? I don't know if you have an opinion on that one.
So I have not seen any research that directly compares Chinese mystery snails to the organisms I was talking about. That doesn't mean the research doesn't exist. It just means that I have not personally seen it. Snails tend to be more of detritivores, meaning they're eating, like dead stuff in lakes. And so I don't envision them actively pursuing zooplankton or anything like that. However, by eating that detritus, you're probably competing with the other organisms we talked about that are also eating detritus in the lakes. In terms of how tasty they are, I actually did have a job where we fed volunteers Chinese mystery snails by choice. It's not like it was forced or anything like that. Chinese mystery snails and rusty crayfish, and you basically they taste like whatever you cook them in. So we cooked them in garlic butter. I don't eat meat personally, so I can't speak personally on that, but I was told they tasted like garlic butter and were very chewy.
From online, we have 10 spiny water to be transmitted from lake ballast tanks of lake boats.
All right, I don't know if you heard that. The question was, can spiny water fleas be transmitted from lake to lake in the ballast tank of wake boats? I don't know if you have any experience with that, Emily.
This one, I think you might be able to answer a little bit better. Wasn't there a research study about this recently?
There was, and what was found by that study, I believe it was done by Tim Campbell and some others from Wisconsin, that the ballast tanks of wake boats don't drain completely, so there can be some species. I don't know if they specifically looked at which one, so I'm not sure if spiny water fleas was one of them or not. But there is probably a more likelihood in wake boat ballast tanks of species being able to survive for longer periods of time when the boat is out of the water than on some other watercraft. Other questions?
Okay, and then insect sprays such as mosquito control that roll into lakes, what effect do they have on these?
Good question. So the question about the effect of insect sprays that might settle into lakes and what those kinds of pesticides and insecticides might, how they might infect the popular creatures.
That's, as far as I know, that's kind of like an up and coming topic of research that I've been hearing about a lot lately. I know that DNR has a lot of plans to do a lot of testing for that this summer. But a lot of these animals, like we talked about, are really sensitive to different types of sprays and pollutants and things like that, especially, let's see here, these macroinvertebrates. So because they have all these gills on the outside of their body, they're particularly sensitive to different types of pollutants. And insect sprays could definitely be one of those, but that's not speaking research based. That's my best educated guess.
And that flows with what I've understood, again, not necessarily research based, but from what I know of products that have been deemed safe, they haven't necessarily been, their effects haven't been studied on all of these types of creatures. So it's
Right.
It's an open question at best.
Mm-hmm.
Got time for a few more.
Several years ago, I observed freshwater jellyfish down in Kentucky, very warm water. But surprisingly, about 10 years ago, our lake is very deep, very clear. And we have a small lake that's attached to it, and it's warmer. We had a very significant blue freshwater jellyfish. What's is that good, bad, or indifferent?
So the question is about freshwater jellyfish, and he's noticed that there have been more jellyfish blooms, if that's what they're called, in Wisconsin lakes than he's seen before, and wonders whether that's good, bad, indifferent. What are your thoughts?
So freshwater jellyfish, that's another invasive species that we're not really sure about the effects of it because they can be so boom bust. They can be, lay relatively dormant in a lake for a long time, and then all of a sudden there's some sort of environmental condition that causes them to bloom more. I'm not sure about how that affects the lake long term. I hope someone is studying that right now. And I have not noticed that there's been more blooms in Wisconsin. I've actually never seen a jellyfish in person before, so I have not experienced that myself.
Other questions? Looks like we've got one.
I am personally seeing our freshwater jellyfish in there. I quite realize at the time it's invasive, but they are really cool. So if you got a chance to experience them, maybe you'll have different or mixed feelings about it.
There was a comment that the person has seen freshwater jellyfish and said they're actually pretty cool. I've had that opportunity as well, and they are. So
Awesome.
invasive or not, they at least look kind of cool. Other questions for Emily? All right. I think that may be it. I think Ashley's going to run up and maybe check the chat one more time to make sure that we haven't missed anyone. I'm an old radio guy, so the dead air is just a killer for me. All right, no more questions. All right, well, thank you so much, Emily. That was a really fun and neat talk, and we will definitely get part 2 of that going in a number of venues, I think. So if you are online, we're moving into lunchtime